unhappiness, basically, intense unhappiness, sometimes called depression, anxiety, periods of anxiety, depressions, throughout my 20s, and even in childhood I was already predominantly unhappy. I remember when we lived in a 3 or 4 story building, and when they were painting the outside of the building, they built a scaffolding. I was about 6, and I thought, oh, we lived on the ground floor. So, well, as long as there's a scaffolding, I have no problem. Whenever I want to commit suicide, I can just climb up and jump down. So I'll be okay as long as the scaffolding is there. That's my way out. That shows the degree of unhappiness. And then at 29, it became more and more acute. And one night the thought came into my head. I describe it very briefly at the beginning of The Power of Now. In the middle of the night, I can't live with myself any longer. There was such intense unhappiness, and the depression, it was just too much to take. At that moment, an inner separation happened. I couldn't have explained exactly at that time, but retrospectively I can explain now what happened because I understand it. I didn't then. An inner separation happened between the unhappy self and a deeper sense of I or beingness, which I now call consciousness itself. So I had been identified throughout my life with an unhappy mind-made entity consisting of self-images and ideas and self-talk in the mind. It's the self-talk that most people are familiar with, but in my case it was particularly destructive and unpleasant. But everybody is familiar with the self-talk in the head. I sometimes call it the voice in the head, which are quite simply the automatic, compulsive, one could say, thought processes that never stop, that either comment on your sense perception, whatever is happening around you, a running commentary. You might recognize that, it might be familiar to you. If you don't recognize it, then you're so identified with it that you don't even know that you have a running commentary on your life. You have become the running commentary in your life. In other words, that, as happened to me, become totally identified with the compulsive thinking that never stopped. That voice in the head that in my case was predominantly negative. And so the emotions that then I felt continuously were the reflection of the predominantly negative self-talk about myself, about other people, about the situation I found myself in. There was ample justification for negative self-talk because I was struggling, I didn't have enough money, I was trying to prove myself, working too hard, had problems with, couldn't find a girlfriend, was too shy, all kinds of twisted up inside. And so basically there was this unhappy me, but at that night I disidentified from it and stood back from it, so to speak. And I suddenly thought, this thought that came to my head, I can't live with myself any longer. There was a stepping back from the thought, and I thought, are there 2 of me or 1? What does that mean? I can't live with myself. Who am I, and who or what is that self that I cannot live with? Then that thought brought about the separation, and then there was an I, and then this unhappy me was somehow recognized as not real. But at that time I couldn't have explained it. It was this very strange experience. All I can say is the next morning I woke up feeling totally at peace. And just opening my eyes, looking around the room, and everything seemed fresh and new. The light coming through the curtains, the simplest objects lying in the table had a certain presence, a benign, wonderful presence to them. Everything I acknowledged, and it was lovely. and there was this underlying peace. And I said, what is this? And then I was living in London at the time. I got on a bus, even going through central London on a bus. Everything seemed so all the people running around the city, everything was so peaceful. I said, this is so strange. And then I bought a notebook and I started a diary, and I started with this first entry was, I don't know what happened to me, but it's something weird. I just have to write this down in case I lose it again. But somehow it stayed with me. It didn't, the intensity had variations in it of the piece, but basically there was always, since then, always some piece in the background of my life. So that was a shift in consciousness. And much later, when I started to investigate other spiritual traditions, Buddhism and mystical Christianity, Gnosticism, Sufism, Zen Buddhism, also the great Hindu teachers, gradually I began to understand that what happened to me, they call awakening or spiritual awakening. And so the understanding wasn't there. There was just the experience of it at first.
Do you think that, a lot of people in the West are doing, if you will, mindfulness practices, and the idea is to, if you will, it's quite often very difficult to stop the talk, but being able to not respond to the talk. And is it, you think, because it takes so much energy to constantly be distracted, that suddenly when you don't have that, you have now the ability to actually respond?
Yes.
And feel the senses and the perceptions?
Yes. So most of the self-talk, the voice in the head, is conditioned by one's past, it's conditioned by one's education, one's upbringing, the culture you've been brought up in, and many personal factors, your parents and so on. All these makes up the kind of talk that happens in your head. A great step forward is already to realize that there is a voice in your head that talks all the time. Because that really, I would say that it's the first glimpse of an awakening, because to realize that there is a continuous self-talk happening, a lot of it totally unnecessary, by the way. We're not talking about the thinking that is helpful and useful and can solve problems in your life and create new things. The mind is potentially a wonderful tool to be able to use in that way. But for many people, the mind is a kind of torture instrument 80% of their lives. And they would be much happier and much more productive without the self-talk. So the first realization is that there is a voice. And that I call that the first awakening, because that means something else has come in. We could call that another dimension of consciousness has come in, which we could call awareness. I sometimes call it awareness. We could call it presence. And I think in Buddhist terminology, that would be called mindfulness. I personally don't use the term, although it's a wonderful thing, mindfulness. I don't use the term because it implies that your mind is full. But but it's actually realizing there are, and this is the beginning of realizing there are two dimensions of consciousness possible in you. One is the dimension of thinking, which is great, but a more vital and deeper dimension is a dimension of simple awareness, which means consciousness. When you think, consciousness takes on a particular form. Every thought is a thought form. It's an energy formation. I'm not a scientist, you're a scientist, but I think if you're totally honest as a scientist, you will probably admit...
Don't ask for too much.
No, you will probably admit that science even now doesn't quite know what a thought is.
No, you're absolutely correct. In fact, the more we pretend we know, confirms reality that we don't, I think.
So my approach is not scientific, but I think there's a lot to be said for looking at it from a scientific angle. But my approach is totally experiential, so you can see for yourself, find for yourself, there is that voice. And then you become aware that that voice has certain patterns to it, repetitive thought patterns that tend to occur again and again, perhaps every day of your life. I had thoughts for years. I had certain thoughts like whenever something happened that wasn't good, I had a thought that would comment on it in my mind, and it would say, of course, bad things always happen to me. It's bound to happen to me. It's, of course, always bad things happen to me. And they did. So it always confirmed that I was right. And, and then with a disidentification, realize there is a space of you from where you can be aware what kind of thoughts are going through your mind all the time. And that the awareness of thought is not a thought. It's simply the ability to look at a thought like a light shining on a thought. And I call that pure or unconditioned consciousness, whereas the thought is consciousness that has become a form. An analogy we could use is to say that consciousness is the vast ocean, and thinking is the waves and ripples on the surface of the ocean. And every wave and ripple has a very short-lived life. It's very fleeting, like every thought, but it pretends to have an independent existence. And then what happens is this continuous identification with the stream of thinking leads to a very serious dysfunction in one's sense of identity, because then your sense of who you are, your sense of I-ness, is derived, your sense of self, is derived from whatever your mind is telling you about yourself. Ideas, opinions, viewpoints about yourself. In other words, your sense of who you are is derived from thought. And that was recognized already by the ancient teachers like the Buddha as erroneous, an illusion. It is in all the ancient teachings expressed in different words, there is a deeper sense of self possible to humans that is not thought, where you truly sense yourself, but not as a story in the head. So you no longer derive your identity from something you are telling yourself in your head, which is extremely limiting, and we call that in spiritual terms ego. It's not quite the same way in which Freud uses ego. So this is when we spiritually use the word ego, basically means complete identification with the stream of thinking and complete absence of awareness. So you are then, it's not only the thinking, of course, then what you say and what you do, your actions, are totally controlled by the conditioned mind, conditioned by the past, reactive patterns. So this is how many people, they relive or live out their parents' unconsciousness, how the faulty upbringing, the dysfunctional upbringing of their parents, they then inflict it on their children. It often goes back many, many generations, similar dysfunctional patterns. So you inherit, the conditioning is inherited, it occupies your mind until somebody comes and says, you told me before we met this happened to you, you had a very dysfunctional upbringing, and then it can happen, the buck stops here, and your awareness suddenly comes in, and you are no longer forced to reenact the old conditioning of your mind. And for this to stop, this awakening needs to happen, and that basically is the essence of spiritual awakening, which is sometimes misinterpreted. People think spiritual awakening is when you suddenly see, I suddenly saw the angel came towards me, or you say, God spoke to me. Mostly it's your mind, but so it's. You're going to say something?
No. I was just holding on to every word, and I was waiting for it to come out, and then you stopped.
So the wonderful thing is it's not that difficult, really, to step out of the stream of thinking. One way, of course, is meditation. The traditional approach is you have certain periods of time, once or twice a day, when you sit down, close your eyes, and instead of involuntarily being drawn into the continuous stream of thinking, you usually, with meditation, you have a technique or method you focus your attention on one thing, which could be a mantra that you repeat. It could be your breathing. It's a very ancient meditation. It could be the inner feeling in your body, the sense of aliveness that pervades your body. In other words, you take attention away from thinking, and that's already a great realization that you are able, actually have a choice of directing attention. You don't have to go with your attention all the time where the habitual thought patterns want you to go. The habitual thought patterns want your attention every time. Every thought says, I matter, give me your attention, follow me, they go this way. And another negative thought, and another one, and another one.